Welcome to The Mend, a podcast for survivors and victims of crime, sponsored through the Center for Crime Victim Services here in Vermont. I'm Anna Nassett, and I am your host for this bi-monthly show. And today on the show, we have Krier here from the Center for Crime Victim Services to discuss human trafficking. Thank you for being here, Kira.
Thank you.
This show was created to take a deeper look at services, organizations, and concepts for victims and survivors of crime. We want to acknowledge the healing process and provide resources not only in our state of Vermont, but throughout the country that could benefit victims of crime as they begin to mend. As I, your host, and myself also a victim and survivor of crime, my healing process and how I navigate through this world is ongoing and ever evolving. I went from years from hiding from trauma to standing up and speaking out against violence and crime. I will share throughout our shows some of the resources that have helped me, but we also enjoy looking at subject matters that I don't know that much about. So I'm excited to have Kira here to educate us on this very important subject. As always, I want to begin with a trigger warning. Our goal is to create a safe place to discuss topics, but with that in mind, we may be talking about stories that have to do with crime, maybe our mental health, or talk about other sensitive subject matter. We urge you to listen at your own discretion. Today, Kira is here from the Center for Crime Victim Services to talk about one of their programs and the work they are doing and how victims and providers can access assistance. Kira is a licensed clinical social worker in Burlington, Vermont, practicing social work for over 20 years. She provides individual, group, and family therapy to children, adolescents, and adults in her private practice. Kira is a certified EMDR therapist and consultant accredited by the International EMDR Association. Kira specializes in working with trauma, sexual abuse, rape, sex trafficking, missing children, victims of crime, kidnapping, car accidents, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and domestic violence, as well as grief and loss issues. Kira, thank you so much for being here today. I would love to start by getting to know you a little bit better. And can you share a little bit more about your history and how you found yourself in this new role with the human trafficking component of the Center for Crime Victim Services?
Sure. So my history of social work. So I think I always knew that in some capacity I wanted to help people, and began my career early as a DCF worker outside of Philadelphia. And then later in life became a victim of crime myself, and really felt motivated and passionate about standing up and trying to assist victims and have them have a voice and really understand what compels people to commit crime, and also to help victims at the same time. And so I think my pathway here in Vermont has really been, I started out working at the network at Clarina Howard Nichols Center, which is a domestic violence, sexual violence shelter agency, and received my master's, finished up my master's here in Vermont. I had begun it in Pennsylvania, but then the crime had taken place and had to move away from Pennsylvania. So finished up here and sort of found myself searching for where is my niche, where do I want to land in this work, and tried a couple things, knew I didn't want to go back to DCF or Child Protective Services, and so tried school social work and didn't really find a fitting there, and stayed in school social work for about 3 years before a psychologist came to me and said, I really want you to join my practice and do private practice. And I was sold,
Awesome.
Like, this is what I want to do. And so I would say about 10 years ago, I felt really compelled to understand the brain of, like, what is the process of becoming a offender versus a victim. And there's two roads, right? You can offend or you can heal. And I really selfishly wanted to understand what that pathway was. And so began working in the Department of Corrections. And my onset was actually in grad school. They had a pilot position for the IDAP program, which is the Intensive Domestic Abuse Program. And I was the victim advocate for that. And immediately just felt really drawn to the work, wanting to understand the Department of Corrections and understand mentalities, and at the same time provide victim services. So I found a way to both have my private practice and began studying EMDR, and then also entered the DOC world. I entered as a mental health clinician, which really meant, so 10 years ago, it meant something different than it does now. But at the time, it really meant, doing psychosocials, understanding where people came from. And when I started, I was hired by an outside, it's contracted work, and I was hired to do EMDR. So I was very excited. I was working with women and really trying to understand, again, like what's the pathway. And then a whole bunch of things changed in Vermont. Governors, things, and the women moved. And the men came into the prison. And it was at that point that I really decided, okay, I think I'm gonna stay. Selfishly, I wanted to like figure out what I needed to figure out for I needed a why, like why something had happened to me. And so started pursuing more DOC work. What I found out is that the people who commit crimes have been victims as well. And it was a big eye-opening experience for me of that perhaps that the person who harmed me had been harmed, and there was a level of compassion that I had to have at that point. So then I was sort of ready, like, okay, I have my answer, and I don't really want to work with incarcerated men forever. So the network actually had a program called Divas, which is discussing intimate violence and accessing support, and it's a domestic violence, sexual violence program for incarcerated women. And 6 years ago, I took that position, and it was at the same time that I had been doing volunteer work for NCMEC, which is the National Center for Exploited Children. And it was at the exact same time that I went to a conference and a learning weekend with, I think it was actually 4 days at NCMEC, where they taught me about human trafficking. And when I heard this woman speak about her experience with trafficking, I was shell-shocked because I had heard that story. And I had heard that story numerous times as a person in DOC working with women. And so taking the position with the network inside just felt like a natural fit. And I sort of brought along with me my passion around human trafficking. And now the program has a grant also funding doing human trafficking work too. But that was really my onset. It was a personal experience that I had in my own life, meeting someone whose child had gone missing and is still missing today. And then I wanted to volunteer for NCMEC, and then went to a training for NCMEC, and then realized, oh my gosh, this is actually happening here in Vermont. Mm-hmm. It doesn't look like or sound like what I was even thinking. You know, right. I was thinking human trafficking was smuggling, right? Even as a social worker who's supposed to be educated on all the things. So it was an eye-opening experience, and that really is what fostered me in this direction, because working at CRCF, and I would say, you know, there's a large percentage of women who are criminalized, their behavior is criminalized because of their victimization. And it was there that I realized I didn't want to just do therapy in my office, that I really wanted to do more. And I didn't know I wanted this job. You know, I was sitting, I was a part of the Vermont Human Trafficking Task Force Subcommittee for Victim Services. I knew the grant was coming. I had no idea until I saw the job description, and immediately was like, oh my goodness, this is me. This is what I want. That's how I landed there. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you've been there since June, correct?
Yes, June 1st. Yeah.
Awesome. So I love hearing people's like very large histories and just your passion for this work and how it's evolved and you've learned.
Yes.
most of us don't get into this work from the easiest of things.
Right. Yes.
But it's what we do with
Yeah.
it. So as we kind of start, could you tell our listeners what is human trafficking? Because it's such a broad term, and I know there's a lot of confusion around it, and even you expressed that in your story of how you got into this work. So just kind of the general description of what human trafficking is.
Yeah. So I'll give you a definition.
Yeah.
Really. So the definition I like to use, the purpose means an action. There has to be a purpose, which would be exploitation, right? Or harboring, recruiting, enticing someone. That's your purpose. Your means is force, fraud, and coercion. So for trafficking, you have to have those three things, unless it's a child. A child, you do not have to have those three things. But for adults, you have to have force, fraud, or coercion. And then there's the action, sexual exploitation, labor trafficking, slavery, those things. That is what human trafficking looks like. There's labor trafficking, there's sex trafficking, there's drug trafficking, right? I'm going to try and talk about all of them, what sex trafficking and human trafficking and the sexual exploitation is. But that is the easiest way to explain it. With children, children cannot consent to being trafficked or sexually exploited, right, but under the age of 18. So they don't have to have the force, fraud, and coercion. However, in labor trafficking with children, they do. So there's a difference there. So
wow.
Yes. So it gets a little complicated, but we actually in Vermont have a fantastic law. One of the reasons is because we're one of the last states to create a law. But because of that, we were able to look at the federal law and also other laws in other states. And so our law is beefy, it's good, it encompasses so much. It has a strong definition of what coercion is and force, so people really can understand it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Too bad that we were one of the last, but great
But
that we
also,
have a good one.
yes.
Sometimes we learn by taking our
Yes.
time. So because we live here in the state of Vermont, we have listeners from all over, but can you tell me how human trafficking shows up in our state of Vermont and how that looks? We'll get into how that looks versus other states. So maybe just talk specifically about our state and how you see it appearing.
So I would say, so for the purpose of here too, I'm just going to say that I'm going to genderize things. So I'm going to speak to women and children because that's mostly what we see, although men are affected and the LGBTQ communities are impacted. Also, traffickers, I'm going to speak about them as if they're male. That's just for ease through conversation, and also that I want to acknowledge that it goes both ways. We have women traffickers and we have men who are victims. How we see, I think in Vermont right now, we're really missing the boat on labor trafficking. The more that when I came into this position, didn't know a lot about it. I was sent to DC to understand the grant and again, was sort of wowed by like, oh, okay, this is what it means. And I think that we're missing the boat on labor trafficking. So labor trafficking can look like when you're promising, so here in Vermont, what it would look like is when you're promising someone to come to the U.S. to perform a job, and you're promising them, this amount of money or a place to live that's going to be great. And it doesn't have to be someone from out of the country. That's the other misconception with human trafficking. This is someone from right in Vermont can be trafficked, right? This doesn't have to be, someone from Ecuador or someone else. It can be within our own borders. So it can be that someone's promised something, and then when they get the job, they're not getting that. They're not getting minimum wage, or they're told, well, I brought you here, so you owe me, and now you have to work off your debt. Like, that's what labor trafficking looks like here. We see that there's some crossover, too. There can be crossover with labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So if we look at massage parlors, just because here in Vermont we've had a major bust happen with massage parlors, and it looked like labor trafficking at first, right? Or that they were being held and not paid, and they had to do certain things. And then a deeper investigation, they're also doing things within the massage parlor that was sex trafficking, being forced to prostitute themselves.
Right.
Yeah. So I think We're seeing not just human trafficking, but labor trafficking. And how human trafficking is really showing up here is through the opioid crisis. That has really driven the market. And what I mean by that is you can be coerced and manipulated into selling yourself so that you can use a drug. Right? So if you're an addict and you're addicted to heroin and someone says to you, if you do this sexual act, I will give you the drug. There is no choice in that. There's no choice. That is, you're talking about basic needs at that point, right? The basic need is I have to survive in safety and maybe even have a place to stay. I have to perform this act in order to, and that is human trafficking. So, and most recently we had a case it was a Vermont federal case. His name was Brian Folks, and we had a conviction, which is great. It's our first federal conviction in
Wonderful.
Vermont. Yes.
Great.
15 victims came forward. 8 testified, and this was someone who used Backpage. He had sexual videos. He was sexually exploiting them. He used motels and photos to advertise the women. And his deal was it's a 50-50 split. Well, his 50-50 was she does a sexual act, he gets 50 for setting it up. But then he gets her hooked on drugs, the coercion piece, right? He gets her hooked on drugs. So then 100% of it is his because, no, you owe me for the drugs. And the deal was I already got the 50%.
Right.
So she actually got no profits, right? There's no profit for her other than being coerced and manipulated and falsified information of like, oh, I promised to do this. And a lot of it is based in that love, I love you. I'll do anything for you. I've got you, especially with that. He had, manipulated girls and women into feeling good about themselves and I've got you and I won't let you down, those types of things, which, it builds someone's similar to domestic violence. That power and control model comes into play then.
Yes.
So I would say that's what we're largely seeing in Vermont is the coercion and manipulation through intimate partner and also, through the drug industry.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing the victory as well.
Yeah.
It's important. We need to have more of those.
Yes.
So looking at Vermont compared to other states, can you share with us ways that you see human trafficking appear in other states and how listeners can be aware within their own communities? Yeah,
I would say the best way is know the indicators, know the red flags. They're the same in every state. Know the flags, there's great websites out there. The anti-trafficking through Ontario is one of the best. They have, every day they put out something, know the signs, and it's a new sign.
What's the website?
It's actually through Twitter.
Okay. Okay.
It's called the Anti-Trafficking Ontario.
Anti-Trafficking Ontario on Twitter. Yep. Okay.
It gives every day, something like, does a teenager have 2 phones? Does someone have more jewelry that is above their normal income bracket? Knowing those signs, is someone retreating from the normal behaviors that he did? So if you have a teenager who's on Instagram all the time and then suddenly is not on Instagram, or the pictures on Instagram are changing into something different, that might be a sign to have a conversation, to those types of things. And my biggest thing is, traffickers don't just target people. They target vulnerability and marginalized people. Mm-hmm. They're looking for vulnerable, marginalized populations.
Yep.
And somehow they just know. Yep. Right? And so looking for that, who might be vulnerable in your community, who is struggling, who can't get a job, and their only means to get their basic needs met, food, shelter, a place to stay, might be through that, right? So looking for those types of things. And traffickers manipulate into trusting them, into I've got your back and I love you. So being aware of that sort of, again, similar to that domestic violence dynamic that happens. But the difference between domestic violence and trafficking is in domestic violence, there's one perpetrator, and in trafficking, there is a tier of people. So you might be here, right? with this trafficker, but he's answering to someone and that person's answering to someone and so on and so forth. So in trafficking, there's multiple actors, where in domestic violence, there's usually one actor.
Right.
So I would say really just knowing the signs, like runaways are at risk, people who have drug addiction, if you notice things are different, how they present themselves. Are they fearful for medical providers? Are they giving you a script history and not sort of deviating from the script? And I notice in my private practice how people, only because I've learned through hard lessons of who's bringing them, who's listening. So familial trafficking happens. So if the parent refuses to leave the room, ask some questions about that. Like, why is that happening? Like, why is your mom answering the questions before you? You know, those types of things. And why is your uncle always with you? Like, really inquiring about those sort of red flags that come up in some people, you know, anything that gives people a gut reaction. We've moved so far away from listening to our intuition, and I'd love to guide us back there. Like, anything that gives you a gut reaction. I just had someone from Newport this morning say, I saw your talk last week and I had a gut reaction to it. And as soon as she told me everything, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a case.
Yes.
Like, so listen to the gut.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Our guts generally veer us right.
Yes, they do.
So can you tell us, we're going to switch a little bit into the work that the center is doing, but can you tell us about the human trafficking grant that the Center for Crime Victim Services has just gotten, or just kind of begun? What services it provides, who's involved, how the community can engage, just like the different players that are all involved, and how this is going to look in our state.
Yeah, I definitely took some notes because I didn't want to forget anything, because I have not been part of the process from day one.
Okay.
So the Vermont Human Trafficking Task Force has existed for 10 years. And I've only been part of that task force the last 3 in my position of divas. So the beginning initiative was out of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Attorney General's Office. And so that was where it began. And then the steering committee now of the Human Trafficking Task Force has 3 co-chairs. And that consists of Cindy McGuire from the Attorney General's Office, Andrew Gilman from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Aaron Stewart, who's a clinical psychologist and has expertise in human trafficking. So they're the 3 co-chairs. They're sort of guiding, and I would say that Aaron was a piloter of the grant. She's
amazing.
Yeah, she's absolutely amazing. A wealth of knowledge in that brain of hers. But so I think she was the spearhead, just from me sort of witnessing it as someone sitting at the table. And now the steering committee consists of various organizations, and that looks like the Vermont Network, the Center for Crime Victim Services, Give Way to Freedom, 2 victim advocates, both from the USA's office and the USG, Vermont State Police, and DCF. Then we have a larger task force system, which has many players: the Department of Labor, Mercy Connections, Prevent Child Abuse Vermont, so many different players coming together to the table to really, how are we going to tackle human trafficking in Vermont? That's what this grant is about. What are we going to tackle? And what are the needs? It's collaborative. So different from most grants where you can sort of do what you want. This is a collaborative agreement with the Bureau of Justice and the Office for Victims of Crime. So they have deliverables that they give to you and that we have to abide by. So we have 3 years. We're already like halfway through year 1, about to go into year 2, even though I was just hired. So we have a little bit of catching up to do. And largely that's like hiring stuff. And also the federal government had a freeze for a little bit, so the money wasn't there. I don't know if people remember that. That happened in January. So
we remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the Vermont State Police and the center were awarded the grant. Both agencies were on the task force already. So those 2 agencies were awarded the grant. And out of that grant came 3 positions. My position, I'm the Victim Services Director. And Roz Renfrew, she is the Human Trafficking Task Force Coordinator. So her job is to coordinate all of this in terms of policy, procedures, making the meetings happen, organizing subcommittees. And then we have Sean O'Connell, who is our newest member. He's probably about 4 weeks in, I think. He is the law enforcement liaison. And so his job is to connect with law enforcement agencies across the state and develop trauma-informed interviewing and hoping that we're all doing the same thing across the state in terms of investigations and prosecutions. So we've only been a full team for a month.
Okay.
So we're getting there, though. And how people could get involved is we have subcommittees. So we have a victim service subcommittee, we have a labor trafficking subcommittee, we have a policy subcommittee, and we have a training and outreach committee. And so each one of those, so the Victim Service Committee, I'm the chair of, and so we're talking about confidentiality, how do we best serve victims, how do we not lose sight of the victim, right? Victim-centered is about not losing sight of the victim.
Yes.
And keeping that in the forefront. How do we talk about, how do we talk with law enforcement when we have confidentiality? If we have crisis worker privilege, how do we connect with law enforcement? Like, those are the projects that we're working on. The labor trafficking is I'm also the chair of. We have our first meeting in December. We're bringing someone in to speak about labor trafficking who has more knowledge than us. Her name is Erin Albright, and she is from New Hampshire, and she's coming in to talk to all of us about it. How might we handle it better? Who are the people we need to have at the table for that? And hoping to really look at that in a deeper way. Mm-hmm. And policy is Roz's niche. She's looking at developing policy. What does it look like? Right now she's working on media policy, like what are the things that we're doing? So for 10 years, this Human Trafficking Task Force has operated with no policies and procedures, and not even part of it. This isn't even their job. They're just doing it out of the goodness of them. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot, right? That people have just taken on things. So this grant is really the first 3 years around organizing and collaborating with partners and figuring out assessing, like, what do we need in our communities? What do victim needs? How can we support prosecution? And at the same time provide good quality services to victims. So if people want to get involved, contact Roz or myself and get on a subcommittee. It's the best way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll get on one.
Yes.
Sure,
great.
why not?
Yes.
That sounds great.
Yes.
So now that we've understood a little bit more of what this is, what is the long-term goal for this human trafficking grant in our state? What do you, maybe not envision, but what are some of the goals that you all are setting moving forward?
So I would say fresh out of the gate, victim services, right? That's also, if law enforcement was here, they might say different, but I'm going to say victim services and prosecutions, right? Like figuring out how to do that. So the first 3 years, if we meet all the deliverables, we can get another 3 years. And at that 3 years, that money is for developing the services. And then if we do all those deliverables, there's another 3 years. So in total, it's 9 years, a possibility of 9 years, right?
Yeah.
So, but I would say fresh out of the gate, what I feel we need to work on is providing better services for victims, looking at prosecutions. How do we do that? How do we identify victims, right? That it's not until the outreach that I've done since June of people didn't even know, like, oh, I didn't know that is what could be happening, or I've seen that and I didn't know that's what it was called, those types of things. So really getting the education piece out there to really educate therapists, providers, Department of Labor, the caseworkers, case managers on the ground of what does it look like so that we can really identify it. And that way we can assess, like, what is the need? Already in this position, the need for us would be treatment and housing, right? Treatment, housing, identification, and identification is a little bit different than what I just said. So women who are coming out of a trafficking situation oftentimes don't have any ID, no forms of ID.
Yep.
Everything is stolen from them. So that process has been such a roadblock for me through this, of like women who we had someone who came from Texas who had no idea and ID with her, and finding the right channels without it taking 6 months has been roadblock after roadblock. So really looking at how do we give better services? How do we get them ID so that they can get their MAT medication, medical assistant treatment? So how do we get them that? How do we get so that they can get a job or be eligible for economic services? They need identification. So that treatment. So in Vermont, we don't have a lot of treatment options here, and particularly if we're dealing with someone who's have substance abuse issues. If they've been to substance abuse treatment before, they oftentimes don't have a good relationship, or they've gotten kicked out before. They're sitting in the same circle as other people they've been trafficked with.
Yep.
Or someone who's still in the game or in the life, so they don't feel safe telling anything. And largely, the substance abuse programs are not looking at diving into the trauma, right? And you have to dive into the trauma in order to heal someone who's been trafficked, or to heal anybody who's had domestic violence, sexual violence, trafficking experience. So really looking at that need, how do we provide basic needs for people who've been trafficked? Our basic needs, the Maslow triangle, like safety. How do we provide safety and housing and food? Like, how do we do those things? Is really on the forefront for me. I want to improve that victim service response and also have that collaboration with law enforcement. In the past with domestic violence and victim services, it's sort of been like one of these.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to be that. I want it to really be cohesive, that we can work together in the best interest of a victim and also have an arrest or have a prosecution. And if we can't, that it's okay. That law enforcement isn't upset and I'm not upset, that we're all just in it together. So I would say that is what I'm hoping for the future.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to kind of tie a couple of these in together. One of the things that I really heard from you is having that trauma-informed practice and how it's so paramount. So to switch gears a little bit, we see a lot of victim blaming, especially in human trafficking. Can you speak to how trauma plays a large part into human trafficking for victims, how you're working on having better trauma-informed practices? And Kara's already agreed to come back again and talk more about trauma with me, which I'm very much looking forward to. But how trauma plays into human trafficking and how we can better evolve our trauma-informed practices.
Absolutely. Like I said to you before, I could probably go on about trauma-informed practice for a very long time.
I will geek out right along with you. So I'm excited for that episode.
And the brain. So trauma-informed practice to me, I've broken it down into the 4 R's. So realize that someone has been impacted by something. Realize that that's happened. Recognize where they're at. Meet them there. Don't assume something else. Just recognize. Then respond without judgment. And then resist re-traumatizing someone. The age-old thing that I still hear from people is like, so why did you do that? It's like, why did he? Why did he? When are we going to hold offenders accountable in the way that they need to be held accountable? And so looking at those 4 R's is trauma-informed, like drilling it into people's heads of like, meet someone where they're at and respond effectively and know that what they've been through was about them trying to survive, that whatever they were doing, it was meeting their basic needs and survival mode, right? So, and I think one of the things, when you say victim blaming, I'm going to go off a little bit about the sort of the phrases that I've heard over the years of like, it's just sex, she deserved it, it's prostitution, she had a choice. You don't have a choice if you have nowhere to sleep.
Yep.
You don't have a choice. If you can't find a job and DCF tells you that you're going to lose your kids, and that's how they interpret it, I'm going to lose my kids. I'm not saying that that's what DCF says, but that's how their interpretation is. And their interpretation is I have to do something. They're going to do that act in order to have the money to feel like, okay, I won't, right? Even though they haven't realized, like trauma messes up the brain pathways of really understanding of how that can complicate things even more. So, that victim blaming of she should have known better, not recognizing that someone is in an addictive cycle and maybe they can't stop. Trauma happens, addiction happens, then trauma happens and addiction happens, right? It's like this circle that keeps going. You use to numb out, right? So then another traumatic thing happens. Guess what? You're going to use again to numb out. So it's that constant. If people had an understanding of addiction, I think that they would better understand human trafficking too, and maybe walk away from like blaming and being like, oh, well, she's an addict. I think one of the other challenges with victim blaming is that defendant and victim duality. So you have someone who's charged with something, like maybe she was drug trafficking because she had to, right? So she's drug trafficking, she has a drug sale, but also she's a victim because she didn't want to do that drug sale. Or maybe she did do that drug sale because she had to do that drug sale, right? In order for her to meet her own addiction, she had to do that, right? So oftentimes we see that duality, and that puts people off of like, oh, she's a criminal, like, yeah, we don't want to do that. So
I had such an eye-opening story at the Vermont Victims Assistance Academy 2 years ago. There was a woman who came in and spoke, and that was, she'd been arrested for drug trafficking, and somebody within the system identified that she had actually been human trafficked. And for me, it was just one of those, I'm like, what? It was a subject I knew nothing about at the time, and really was so grateful to hear her voice, and that there were people within the system that identified that and were able to come to her from that trauma-informed place. It was huge. Because it was just something I hadn't ever thought about or put together yet.
And 70% of our emotions have a physical reaction, right? So think about our brains, right? Our brain, like when you get angry, how do you respond? What happens physically to you?
I clench or I yell or whatever.
Right. I flame up with red, red right away, right? Our bodies have a physical response. Well, if your body has a physical response, your critical thinking goes out the door.
Right.
You cannot critically think about things, right, when your body's responding. Now think about being in that hyper-aroused state all the time, because your brain is scared. You're scared and you think you're going to die all the time. So you're living in hyperarousal, right? So that 70% is now at 90%, and there's no way to calm yourself down.
Yes, I understand that oh so well. Oh so very well.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's hard to deactivate the brain when you're hyper-aroused. When, almost everybody has had an anxiety attack in their lifetime. Some sort of panic or anxiety, like feeling. If you can think about that moment and how hard it was to talk yourself off the ledge, that's what I'm talking about. Someone who's living on the ledge, right? That they can't, their body is constantly like, I might die, I have to do this. So that critical thought process isn't going to happen. They're not going to do the things you want them to do, right? Like if you're telling them to show up at an appointment or, come to Thanksgiving dinner and they don't show up, and you're sort of, someone is like, I don't know, I do all these things for her and she never shows up. Yeah, because that's the last thing she's thinking about, right? She's traumatized, and all she can think about is the next moment, the next foot in front of her. So if you're telling her to go to an appointment, that's out the door before she even left your house, because her next thought is, how do I keep myself safe in the next moment? Okay, have a cigarette. What's the next moment? Go get a coffee. Okay. And going to have an appointment is way out of her brain at this point. So it looks like apathy, right? Or someone who doesn't want to do anything, or she doesn't really care, she doesn't want to get her life together, when actually it's the brain responding to the trauma, and there's nothing left for her to do.
Yeah.
So that's where the victim blaming and the trauma sort of intersect with each other. It looks like this, but that's not what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm very excited to talk more with you about that.
Yes.
Because it's a subject very near and dear to my heart, and thank you for kind of explaining that better to our listeners. So I have Krier here, today from the Center for Crime Victim Services, and we've been talking about human trafficking as well as many other subjects. Would you be able to, we've been talking pretty specifically about Vermont, would you be able to pick a story from recent news that involves human trafficking and unpack it a little bit for our listeners? I left this one very open to you. What direction you wanted to go?
Yes. It was hard. I think there's a couple things that I feel important to say. So one is there is no child pornography because children can't consent, right? It's child sexual abuse.
Right.
So let's get that clear.
Okay.
Media, let's get it clear.
Let's get it clear. Yeah.
I think the other part for me is that there's so many things that the media, there's so many, just recently, so many different things. R. Kelly, right? I'm just going to take R. Kelly because it's probably the least political charged one, right?
Sounds good.
So we all, I don't know about you, but I was probably in my 20s when R. Kelly was popular, and I was like dancing, jamming out to his music.
Absolutely.
I also was watching MTV and him with Aaliyah. Aaliyah was 15. We all watched it. We all watched it.
Yes.
And nobody did anything for her. Nobody did anything. Now, 20 years later, we're saying something about it. And Aaliyah's not even here to stand up or say anything differently. He was 25, 30 at the time, and she was 15.
Yes.
That was child sexual abuse. I get so heated up and angry about the media saying young women, like
they're children.
with the Jeffrey Epstein, like they were girls.
Yeah.
They were girls. And why are we calling them boys when they're the same age? And, we call them boys, so why not call them girls? But there's that difference here in the media. And, I think we all watched it and nobody did anything. And that's where the problem lies, right? Systemically, our position around women has to change, like how the media represents us, what our role in society is, has over the years been over-sexualized, and somehow we give passes to men of power for sexually exploiting women and children and sexually abusing. And that is something that I think as a collective, we all need to work on. There is a great documentary that I wanted to mention on this, and it's called Who Took Johnny? It's on Netflix. NCMEC, the National Center for Exploited Children, that was one of the first missing children, Johnny. And that mother, I don't know how to say her last name, but it's Grouch, I think. She, in the documentary, she just went full out. She tracked how he went missing all the way into a sex trafficking ring.
Wow.
Yes, it is so powerful.
Who took Johnny?
Who Took Johnny?
Okay.
It's on Netflix. It's amazing. What's interesting is what happens is that the media and other people start to almost gaslight her of like, you're making this up, or you just want it to be that he's still alive. Like you can really see the dynamics that it sort of shifts into her being gaslit about her situation. But she, for me, was another like eye-opening documentary of, missing kids, right? Yeah. Where are they going, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where are they going? So I think, just recently, I think it was just 2 weeks ago, there was an Arizona politician who was arrested for sex trafficking. I mean, he was taking pageant women and putting them in the South Pacific in a rundown motel and harvesting their babies and then selling them for millions of dollars.
Wow.
Yeah. So we have some things to do. Like the portrayal of women has to change. And he's been charged, right? So this Arizona politician, he's been charged with sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, sale of a human, all those things. But there has to be we have to hold society accountable for how we look at women and children and that blame, and systemically unpack that.
Awesome. I could not agree more. So thank you for coming on to talk about that.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into one of my final questions. Like, your passion is very evident. How do you envision a future where we can start to be working on these things and shifting the paradigm and hopefully reducing human trafficking?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you've said a little bit about that, but yeah, just what do you envision if you could dream into it?
Yeah, I think, to end this, right, to end violence against women. Let's just breathe that in. To end violence against women, We have to educate. We have to believe survivors. We have to meet people where they're at, be aware of human trafficking, what sexual assault looks like. We have to be willing to listen and provide support and educate and fundraise and be passionate and all of those things in order to eradicate violence against women. Those are the steps we need to take. And I want people to be excited about whatever your passion is, right? Whatever the passion is, be passionate about that and then do the work. Like, start advocating. We need less people doing this, right? Not like, and taking this and providing action for that. If you feel passionate about sex trafficking, do something, raise awareness, have a run, do a 5K, give Way to Freedom is the nonprofit here in Vermont, like raise money for them, do a yoga class. That's what I just did. I did a yoga class to raise money for them. So, because that's my thing.
Yeah. Use what you're passionate
about.
And keep giving voice to this.
And give voice.
So that saying end violence against women isn't just so far removed.
Right.
That it could actually be
right.
a real thing. And I love it. I think just doing what we're passionate about is such a tremendous place to start.
Yeah.
Because we all have our gifts and our the things we love. And and even if you are spending all the time on your social medias, you can use that as a tool too.
Yeah. I'm a constant retweeter.
Yeah.
I'm like retweet.
I'm always shocked on I very rarely share on my personal page, but if I share an article having to do with sexual assault, very few people will regard it.
Yeah.
If I share a picture of my dog, everyone's going to lose their mind.
Right.
So,
Yeah, can we just lose our mind about women?
Yeah.
Can we just
I actually
lose
will
our mind
sometimes,
about that?
on my business page for Stand Up Resources, I will post a picture of my dog and, tie it into something pertaining to my work, just to be like, does this work or not?
Yes,
it totally does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, But that's, so use your skills.
Yeah.
So this has been amazing and such a huge wealth, and I'm very excited that you're going to come back on in the new year. Are there any main points? I mean, this is a subject we could talk about for hours, and so thank you for giving us an overview, but are there any main points that you feel like we left out today?
I don't think main points. I mean, I think educating yourself, know the signs, and create an understanding. Don't say it doesn't happen here. It's happening here. It's happening here.
It all happens here, people.
Yes, it's happening here. So I think really understanding that it is happening here, and we don't have exact data yet for this next year, but even Katie G, who is the human trafficking case manager, she had reported in a short period of time of already working with 54 survivors. So it's happening, right?
Yeah.
And that's only people that we've identified because the education isn't out there.
Yeah.
So
it's a small state. That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people. Yeah.
So keep informing each other. Yes. Absolutely. So Krier, it's been such a great time having you here today. The work you were doing is not easy, and thank you for dedicating your life to it. It's really inspiring and humbling, so thank you for sharing with us. Krier here with the Human Trafficking Program at the Center for Crime Victim Services. You can get more information at the Center for Crime Victim Services website. Or what was the nonprofit here in our state?
Give Way to Freedom.
Give Way to Freedom would be another great place to get research or get information. I always like to close with a positive message. Is there one parting thought for listeners today, whether they're victims or survivors of crime or those helping them? Who knows who's listening? So,
whatever you're going through, you are not alone, and you are important. That whether you're depressed or anxious or feeling like you don't quite fit in, you are not alone. I think that you're important, and I don't even know you. And if you can just push through the darkest moments of our lives, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I promise that. there is always a light at the end of the dark. And knowing that you are important and you are worth it and you have something to give back to this universe is the most important message.
I love that. Thank you.
Yes.
It's like go home and quietly weep. It's really good. So that does it for this week. Thank you again, Kira, for joining us. If you have any questions or ideas, you can always email me, Anna@standupresources.com. I'm your host, Anna Nassett, here with the Center for Crime Victim Services on The Mend. Be well, be strong, and we'll see you next time.